In the vast, suffocating expanse of the Qing Empire, being a doctor wasn't a symbol of prestige or intellect, it was an inconvenience. A necessary nuisance tolerated only because death, inconveniently, refused to wait for emperors or peasants to find enlightenment. In a world where superstition was science and ignorance was policy, the physician stood awkwardly between the two, holding a pulse with one hand and a prayer with the other. The empire stretched like a great dying body, opulent on the outside, rotting quietly within, and its doctors were tasked with keeping the illusion alive. They didn't heal men, they preserved appearances. Their art wasn't medicine, it was theater. A delicate, dangerous performance where one wrong diagnosis could cost not only a life, but the head of the man who dared to make it. Imagine for a moment being summoned to the Forbidden City. The emperor is pale, coughing into silk embroidered with dragons, and every exhalation feels like an omen. You, a mere mortal, are expected to cure the Son of Heaven himself, not with logic, not with knowledge, but with the right words. The wrong prescription could be seen as disloyalty, the wrong tone, a confession of treason. In the Qing court, medicine was politics disguised as compassion. You weren't treating a body, you were managing divine fragility. So you smiled, murmured about energy flow, and mixed herbs that could neither heal nor offend. If the emperor recovered, you were a genius. If he died, the cosmos would demand a scapegoat. And who better than the man who dared to touch his pulse? It was an era where the physician's hands were cleaner than his conscience, a time when the highest virtue was not to save lives, but to avoid blame. There was beauty in that hypocrisy, a kind of poetic cruelty. The Confucian order valued obedience above truth, harmony above honesty. So the doctors learned to speak in metaphors, to diagnose without diagnosing, to survive in the cracks of an empire allergic to reality. Illness was not biological, it was moral. If you were sick, you had offended balance, violated the invisible laws of yin and yang. The doctor's task was not to repair the body, but to correct your spirit, to realign your shame with the rhythm of the universe. And if that failed, well, perhaps it was destiny's way of reducing the population. Medicine, you see, was not a profession. It was an act of survival. A doctor who knew too much was a threat. One who cured too effectively risked envy. One who failed too often risked execution. So the wise physicians of the Qing practiced the most valuable art of all, restraint. The art of doing just enough to appear essential, but never enough to provoke consequence. They hid behind the poetry of prescriptions, lotus root for calm, deer antler for virility, powdered pearls for beauty, and sold illusions wrapped in silk. The patients believed because belief was cheaper than truth. And truth, in those days, was a crime few could afford. Still, there was a tragic dignity in their work. In the dim corners of herbal shops, between jars of ginseng and dried scorpions, some men genuinely tried to understand the body. They traced the pulse with trembling fingers, not to flatter emperors, but to defy decay itself. But the empire wasn't built to reward sincerity. Their discoveries were silenced by bureaucracy, their cures dismissed by dogma. To question ancient wisdom was to insult the ancestors, and in a culture that worshipped the dead more than the living, that was the ultimate heresy. So the doctor learned to bow to the patient, to tradition, to ignorance, and called it wisdom. The irony, of course, is that the Qing Empire prided itself on harmony, yet feared every symptom of change. It built walls not only around its cities, but around its ideas. Medicine became ritual, knowledge became obedience, and progress was declared a disease. The physicians became priests of decay, reciting the scriptures of balance, while epidemics spread like whispered secrets. When smallpox ravaged villages, they blamed the heavens. When plague reached the capital, they prescribed incense, and when the people died, they called it fate. After all, fate was the empire's favorite anesthetic. It numbed responsibility. There's a peculiar cruelty in watching an entire civilization suffocate under the weight of its own traditions. The Qing doctor knew what was wrong, but he also knew better than to say it. Because truth, in that time, had consequences. To tell a nobleman that his fever came from contaminated water, not from a vengeful spirit, was to insult his ancestors. To suggest that the emperor's chronic ailments might be worsened by indulgence was to risk decapitation for insolence. So the physicians smiled, bowed, and administered potions that healed pride while killing the body. It was theater of the highest order. The empire applauded, and no one noticed the curtain was burning. But let us not be too harsh. Every empire breeds its own brand of cowardice. The Qing doctors merely adapted to survive. They were mirrors of their age, elegant, cautious, and profoundly tired. Some drank their own medicines, perhaps to test them, perhaps to forget. Others wrote treatises that no one would read, hoping that a future less frightened of truth might find them. And a few, very few, dared to dream of anatomy, of blood and organs, of diseases that could be named and cured. But they remained whispers in an empire that preferred poetry to progress. Ironically, while Europe dissected bodies and mapped veins, the Qing scholars debated the moral implications of opening a corpse. Knowledge was seen as desecration, curiosity as arrogance. The body was sacred, not because it contained truth, but because it contained taboo. So China, for all its grandeur, stagnated in a perfumed tomb of ritual. And the doctors, those frail custodians of life, were condemned to decorate the dead instead of saving the living. Imagine the exhaustion of it, to know enough to see the lie but not enough to escape it, to touch the pulse of an empire and feel it fading, yet be forbidden to say so. That was the physician's tragedy. He was both witness and accomplice, savior and executioner. His herbs preserved a civilization that refused to heal, and in doing so, he became its metaphor, beautiful on the outside, diseased within. Centuries later, when historians speak of the Qing decline, they'll mention opium, corruption, rebellion, but rarely will they speak of the quiet daily decay in the doctor's hands. The slow death of truth beneath layers of incense and fear, the silent epidemic of obedience that infected even the healers. Because what is an empire, if not a body? And what is a doctor, if not its conscience? The Qing doctors learned to silence that conscience, to trade cure for comfort, to exchange science for superstition, until the empire itself forgot how to breathe. And perhaps that's the most poetic irony of all. The men trained to preserve life ended up embalming a civilization. Their failure wasn't incompetence, it was loyalty. They served the system faithfully, and the system rewarded them with extinction. When the West arrived with stethoscopes and scalpels, the Qing doctors clung to their ginseng roots and prayer scrolls, defending not medicine but memory. They weren't fighting for health, they were fighting for identity. And identity, like disease, doesn't go quietly. So yes, being a real doctor in the Qing era was a shame. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because intelligence itself was forbidden. Not because they didn't want to heal, but because healing meant rebellion. Every diagnosis was a negotiation with death and power, every prescription a gamble with survival. They stood at the intersection of reason and ritual and chose the only path that kept them alive, the one paved with silence. In the end, perhaps that's what the empire deserved: doctors who lied beautifully, emperors who died gracefully, and a people who mistook endurance for health. The tragedy of the Qing physician wasn't his ignorance, it was his elegance. He made decay look like devotion. He turned failure into philosophy. And for a while, it worked. Until the day the empire stopped breathing, and there was no one left brave enough to take its pulse.